Combat in an urban environment is physically demanding, psychologically trying, and strategically complicated. The presence of large buildings, obstructed sightlines, and civilian populations makes it arguably the most difficult terrain to fight on. In this episode, we'll look at some examples of urban combat and the different military tactics used in these situations. During World War II, Allied forces in Western Europe often fought their way through occupied towns and cities, many of which had already been bombed into ruin. However, one of the largest urban battles fought by U.S. troops took place in October 1944 in Aachen, Germany, a city that had not been heavily damaged. Located along the Nazis' supposedly impenetrable Siegfried Line, Aachen was the first German city to face invasion by U.S. forces, and from the outset, the Americans were at a disadvantage. Using their extensive knowledge of the city's layout and its maze of streets and alleyways, the Germans ambushed the Americans from concealed positions, such as inside sewers and cellars, and from the roofs of tall buildings. To counter these tactics, U.S. forces eventually resorted to blasting passageways between adjoining buildings, so they would not have to enter the streets and risk being pinned down by enemy fire, essentially destroying the city in order to take it. By the end of the battle, 170 tons of bombs and close to 10,000 artillery shells had been fired into Aachen. Marines in Vietnam would face some of the most brutal urban combat in history during the Battle of Hue. At the end of January 1968, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces attacked the city as part of the Tet Offensive. Concealing themselves amongst Hue's large civilian population, the Communists forced the American and South Vietnamese into prolonged fighting. It would take 3.5 weeks of intense house-to-house combat to finally drive the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong out of Hue. However, the victory came at a tremendous cost. Much of the ancient city was reduced to rubble by airstrikes, and more than 2,500 civilians were inadvertently killed or wounded as a result of the fighting. Urban combat, as violent as what was experienced in Hue, would take place yet again in Fallujah during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Codenamed Operation Phantom Fury, the second battle in the city was the first time U.S. troops were engaged solely by insurgents. Using guerrilla tactics, they turned houses into bunkers and ambushed the Americans, forcing them to find cover in places that often had undesirable lines of fire. Because of this, house-to-house fighting became a constant, and U.S. troops were sometimes made to engage in hand-to-hand combat. Often compared to the Battle of Hue because of the intensity of the fight, Fallujah would end as the bloodiest battle of the Iraq War. In almost every conflict the United States has been involved in, from the Mexican War to the Civil War to modern day, U.S. troops have engaged in urban combat. So how do you think urban operations will change in the future? Do you think unmanned ground vehicles will eventually take over many combat responsibilities? Or do you think boots on the ground will always be a necessary element? Leave your thoughts and opinions below.